Hi, I'm Joe Graydon.
I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy, where we bring you the stories behind the health headlines.
This podcast is brought to you by Redix Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Body Cream. 800-345-7339, on the web at uttercream.com. For decades, we've been told salt is risky and a low-sodium diet is healthy. What if that advice is wrong? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
The American Heart Association says all Americans should get less than 1,500 milligrams of sodium daily. The FDA is just about to jump on the low-salt bandwagon, too.
New research suggests low-sodium diets may actually be harmful. Find out what the latest research shows about the sweet spot for sodium.
Could cell phones increase the risk for cancer? We'll talk about the latest research.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, we take your calls and questions about salt, cell phones, and your summer first aid kit.
First, this news.
In the People's Pharmacy health headlines, more Americans than ever are overweight or obese. A new study in JAMA found that approximately 35% of men and 40% of women are now considered obese. Although men seem to have plateaued, the latest data suggests that women are gaining weight at unprecedented rates. A separate study found that 17% of children and teens are now also considered obese.
Extra pounds make people more vulnerable to diabetes, heart disease, arthritis, and some types of cancer. All of these may contribute to premature death. Experts are perplexed about how to reverse these trends. The obesity epidemic in this country has been raging for 3 decades, and what we've been doing so far has not had great success. An editorial published in the same journal calls for prevention beginning in the womb. Part of the problem has been conflicting advice. For years, parents were urged to give their children only skim milk, and that's what's provided in the school lunch program. A recent study showed, though, that kids who drink whole milk seem to gain less weight. The authors of the editorial suggest that it's time for an entirely different approach, one that emphasizes collaboration with the food and restaurant industries that are in part responsible for putting food on dinner tables.
Although we are often told we should avoid fat in order to keep from getting fat, a Spanish study throws that advice into question. The PrediMed study of a Mediterranean diet shows that consuming a diet enriched with extra virgin olive oil or nuts does not lead to weight gain compared to a low-fat diet. The study included nearly 7,500 overweight adults at high risk of heart disease and lasted for 5 years. The volunteers were not advised to restrict their calories or increase their physical activity. The Mediterranean diets that were studied were high in fat, with about 42% of calories from fat. But people in all 3 groups lost a little weight rather than continuing to gain. Those in the olive oil group lost more, a difference that was modest but statistically significant. Americans should not be afraid to include nuts and olive oil in their menus, as the research shows eating a healthful diet that includes these high-fat items doesn't make one fat.
Exercising on a hot summer day can make you thirsty. A new study suggests that soft drinks are not the best way to quench that thirst. The research was done in rats that were exposed to heat without access to liquid. This resulted in mild dehydration. The animals were then allowed to drink water with the sweetener stevia, or water with fructose and glucose equivalent to most soft drinks. The rats that drank water sweetened with fructose and glucose were more easily dehydrated when water restriction was repeated. They were also more likely to experience kidney damage as a result of the dehydration. If this reaction holds up for humans, it suggests that people should not rehydrate with soda when the weather's hot.
One of the more popular diarrhea remedies in the pharmacy is loperamide, also sold under the brand name Imodium. The FDA has just issued a warning that exceeding the recommended dose of loperamide could cause serious heart problems. The FDA notes that irregular heart rhythms or arrhythmias can lead to fainting or, in extreme conditions, cardiac arrest. This life-threatening reaction can also result when loperamide is combined with other medications. The FDA lists a few examples, including the heartburn drugs Tagamet and Zantac, and antibiotics such as clarithromycin and erythromycin. People using loperamide for traveler's diarrhea should be especially careful not to exceed the dose listed on the label.
Research in mice suggests that a multifactorial nutritional supplement might be able to delay nerve cell degeneration. Scientists at McMaster University bred mice to age rapidly with visible deterioration in brain function. Such mice lose about half their brain cells by the time they're a year old, but providing them with cod liver oil, certain herbal extracts, and some specific vitamins forestalled brain cell loss and allowed them to maintain their balance and their ability to learn mazes. It'll be interesting to see if this can be adapted for use in humans. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon. I'm a medical anthropologist.
And I'm Joe Graydon. I'm a pharmacologist.
For decades, we've been told that salt is bad for us, and we should all strive to minimize our sodium intake. The American Heart Association insists that Americans, at least adult Americans, should get less than 1,500 milligrams of sodium a day. That's just about 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt. But is that really healthy?
To find out more, we turn to Dr. Andrew Mente, Associate Professor of Clinical Epidemiology and Biostatistics at McMaster University. He and his colleagues recently published a big study on sodium and cardiovascular disease in The Lancet.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Andrew Mente.
Thank you for having me.
We are delighted to have you on the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Mente, and we'd like you to tell us a little bit about why you undertook this really rather large investigation into the impact of sodium on health and longevity.
Well, over the last 5 or 6 years, there's been a number of studies that have shown that the optimal level of sodium intake as far as reducing cardiovascular disease and mortality is concerned is more or less in the middle. So having either a high intake or a low intake has been shown in previous studies to be associated with cardiovascular disease and mortality. And our study is simply the largest to look at that. It's in a global population, so the advantage of that is you have a very broad intake of sodium from very low levels to very high levels, and that can help you characterize the shape of the relationship with a pretty high degree of statistical resolution on a global scale. And what we found is that overall you find that there's a U-shaped relationship between sodium and cardiovascular disease and mortality, meaning that, again, just like previous studies, we find that being in the middle is optimal. If you're at high levels, exceeding around 6 grams per day, which is a very high amount that actually only 10% of the population consume, you see an increased risk. And if you're at low levels, below, say, around 3 grams per day, you also see an increased risk. So most people actually fall in that middle range. I'd say about 3 out of 4 people globally fall in the middle, which is actually what they should be eating, according to the data.
Dr. Mente, you said your study, the study you and your colleagues did, is one of the largest, or perhaps the largest, of this topic so far. Just how many people were included?
So we pulled data from 4 prospective cohort studies, and so the total number of participants was over 133,000 people in 49 countries. And the other thing that's important to point out is that we looked at the relationships between sodium and clinical events, both in people with normal blood pressure and in people with high blood pressure, to see if the relationship and the shape of the relationship is different in each of these subpopulations, because we know sodium is related to blood pressure and blood pressure is related to cardiovascular events. So it makes sense to look at what the relationships are within these subpopulations. And what we found was that regardless of whether people have high blood pressure or normal blood pressure, you find that low sodium compared to average sodium is associated with increased risk. At the high end, you find that high sodium compared to average sodium is associated with increased risk, but only in people with high blood pressure. In the people with normal blood pressure, high sodium was not associated with increased risk compared to usual. So in other words, just to summarize, in both normal and high blood pressure individuals, low sodium intake is related to harm, but high intake is related to harm only in people with high blood pressure. And that's really the bottom line.
And quite candidly, Dr. Mente, your study created a firestorm of controversy. And that's because in large measure for the last, I'd say, 30 to 50 years, North Americans have been told, get your sodium down. Salt's a killer. And the American Heart Association has encouraged everyone to get their sodium below 1,500 milligrams per day, which is a pretty hard task. Not that many people can do it. Food doesn't taste very good. And they're still insisting, by the way, even after your study, that 1,500 milligrams is the goal or below. And they are not happy with your results.
Yes. So what is currently, you're absolutely right. What is currently recommended right now is what nobody eats, basically, anywhere in the world, apart from a few hunter and gatherer populations that only live up to the age of 40. So the human experience of what is currently recommended is virtually non-existent. And the current recommendations are based on the premise that we know that sodium is related to blood pressure. And so what they assume is that because sodium is related to blood pressure and blood pressure is related to cardiovascular disease, they assume that you can extrapolate the effect of sodium on cardiovascular events through blood pressure. But unfortunately, the body doesn't quite work that simple. And so what happens, what we know is that when you lower sodium to low levels, yes, you do lower blood pressure, but it also has unintended consequences in that you activate certain rescue mechanisms that the body has under low sodium conditions, such as activation of certain neurohormonal systems like the renin-angiotensin system or increases in certain lipid levels.
And renin-angiotensin is important because, I'm assuming it's important, since that's how the so-called ARB blood pressure medicines work, by blocking renin and angiotensin, right?
That is exactly right. Exactly. So when you take an ARB or an ACE inhibitor, what you're doing is you're lowering blood pressure, but you're also preventing activation of the renin-angiotensin system. Whereas when you lower sodium intake, you are also lowering blood pressure, but you're not blocking the activation of the renin-angiotensin system. In fact, it increases its activation. So it's not the same as taking a blood pressure-lowering medication. And yet it's assumed by many people that when you lower sodium, that there are no other effects on the body. It's just the blood pressure, which we know is simply not true. It's a false assumption.
It's my understanding, Dr. Mente, that the renin-angiotensin system, as well as the catecholamine system, which involves like adrenaline, epinephrine, norepinephrine, all of these are like stress hormones. So your body seems to be overreacting when sodium levels get really low. That doesn't seem like a good thing. And I think you also mentioned that cholesterol goes up?
That's exactly right. So cholesterol, we find, goes up. Triglycerides go up. And as you said, yes, those catecholamines, those are the fight or flight hormones, or stress hormones. And of course, we know angiotensin 2 is one of the most vascular damaging substances known. And so that cannot be a good thing when that goes up as well. And so these are rescue mechanisms that are in place naturally by the body under low sodium conditions, because sodium is a mineral that the body needs. it needs for its survival. And we also know that every single other nutrient that the body needs also has a U-shaped relationship with health measures. So why would sodium be any different? And so the fact that you see a U-shaped relationship for an essential nutrient like sodium is actually not surprising, and yet it's still not widely accepted as being a true finding by some people who still cling to this concept that low sodium is optimal.
For a lot of people, sodium has been a guilty, sort of sinful food for a long time. And so the idea of eating, pretzels, for example, it's like, oh, that's not good for me, but I just love them so much and they've got extra salt. Do people need to feel bad about eating a pretzel now and again?
No, certainly not. The occasional pretzel and bag of chips is certainly fine. If you have too many of them, of course, then you can end up going in the upper range. But most people don't fall in that range. You look at free-living populations, 3 out of 4 people fall in that normal range. And these are people that are just going about their everyday lives. So physiologically, we're probably programmed to eat a certain amount of salt that just so happens to be in the optimal range. So unless you consciously really go out and binge on salt, in which case you'll probably say, I've had too much salt. I feel thirsty. I don't want to have any more salt. And just by looking at the distribution of where most people lie in that distribution, you probably don't really need to even worry about sodium. But just keep in mind that you should probably avoid binging on high-salt foods for prolonged periods of time. But very few people do that according to the data.
Why do you think this is such an emotional issue for organizations like the American Heart Association, for example, or with dietitians and nutritionists? I mean, when you talk about sodium and salt and reveal the new data, some people get very angry.
Yes, well, it is a paradigm shift. And so in science, whenever you have a paradigm shift, not everybody comes aboard initially. You look at trans fat back in the 1980s, there were a large number of studies that showed that trans fat might actually be harmful. And many investigators dismissed the findings. They said, it's rubbish. Trans fat's good for you. So, and then eventually, of course, it was agreed by everyone that trans fat is actually quite nasty. So whenever you get a change in paradigm in science, it's normal to get a reaction like this where people, scrutinize the data, et cetera, et cetera. But as more data comes along, there's now data on over 400,000 people and counting, showing that low sodium compared to average sodium might be harmful. And so I think as more data comes along, there's going to be more and more people that come aboard. Now, certainly, there will always be some that will never accept the concept that low sodium is harmful, but I think that with time, those people will be increasingly isolated as more data gets published.
You're listening to Dr. Andrew Mente, Associate Professor of Clinical Epidemiology and Biostatistics at McMaster University.
After the break, we'll wrap up our conversation with Dr. Mente.
And we'd like to hear from you. Have you been cautious about salt intake? How do you feel about the new research from Dr. Mente and his colleagues?
Share your reaction to this latest flip-flop on salt and heart health. Our lines are open at 888-472-3366. You can email us radio@peoplespharmacy.com or reach us via Twitter. Again, give us a call, 888-472-3366.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you like this podcast of The People's Pharmacy and want to continue the conversation, you can join us online at facebook.com/People's Pharmacy to share your thoughts or comments.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by Red X Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions that moisturize deeply to make dry skin feel soft and smooth. The number's 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
If you'd like to purchase a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. It's show number 1038. The number again, 800-732-2334, or find it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today, we're bringing you up to date on stories behind the health headlines. In a few minutes, we'll find out about the latest research on cell phones and cancer. But first, we'd like to hear from you. Do medical flip-flops on diet advice like sodium confuse you? Are you tempted to shoot the messenger? Our lines are open at 888-472-3366. Email us, radio@peoplespharmacy.com. Again, to join the conversation, the number is 888-472-3366.
Well, a few weeks ago, The Lancet published an analysis of cardiovascular risk associated with different levels of sodium intake. There were 133,000 people in the study, more or less, which makes it one of the largest on this topic. As we just heard, both very low and very high sodium intakes seem to pose hazards.
We're talking with one of the authors of that study. Dr. Andrew Mente is Associate Professor of Clinical Epidemiology and Biostatistics at McMaster University.
Now, there are some people who really do need to watch their sodium and make sure it doesn't get too high. The same week that your study came out in The Lancet, there was a study published in JAMA Internal Medicine, I believe, showing that people with chronic kidney disease do better, again, between around almost 3,000 milligrams of sodium and 4,500 milligrams of sodium a day. So the range is a little narrower than the range you found, but it's not that different on the lower end.
Yeah, now if you look at that paper carefully in JAMA Internal Medicine, first of all, because the study is not global and it has a much more narrower range of sodium, you don't see the full shape of the relationship. But if you look at the figures in that paper, you could see that at the low end, despite the small numbers, you start to see a little bit of an increased risk of myocardial infarction with low sodium, but it's not statistically significant because they have small numbers. Whereas our study, because of its sheer size, we're able to characterize that low end of the curve. And so certainly at the high end, you see an increased risk in that paper, and in our paper as well in people with hypertension. So certainly it's important to get the hypertensive or high-risk individuals that are at high levels of sodium down to moderate levels. That we fully agree. There's no disagreement there. Where the disagreement lies is how low should you go for everyone, and that's the part that's contentious.
Dr. Mente, what are the implications of your study, and how should the public respond to this research and other research suggesting that very low sodium levels can be harmful to their health?
I would say if you follow an all-around healthy diet, eat your fruits and vegetables, exercise, and don't smoke, you don't have to worry about sodium. No need to focus on a single nutrient. Follow an all-around healthy diet, and you should be fine. Certainly, you want to limit processed foods and things like that, but not because of the sodium, only because you want to stick to generally natural foods as a way to achieve a healthy diet, but you don't have to worry about sodium as a single nutrient unless you have very high levels of sodium and also have high blood pressure. That's according to our findings.
Dr. Andrew Mente, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Dr. Andrew Mente, Associate Professor of Clinical Epidemiology and Biostatistics at McMaster University. You'll find a link to his study from our website.
The FDA, the CDC, and the American Heart Association all say you should get your salt intake below 2,300 milligrams daily. In fact, the FDA is thinking about new guidelines. Yet Dr. Mente's research says such levels just might be too low. His data suggests that if you're getting between 3 and 6 grams of sodium daily, you're probably just about right. Who do you believe?
Well, we'd like to hear from you, and we go to Leah in Wilmington, North Carolina. Hi.
Hi, Joe and Terry. I think Dr. Mente just kind of touched on my question. I was wondering, is there any difference in the recommendation for getting salt, from processed foods or just throwing a little salt on something that you've prepared naturally, such as vegetables? Does there seem to be any, difference for people in how they get their salt and what type of foods they get their salt from?
You have a whole lot more control over the salt that you put on the food that you're cooking at home than you do over salt in processed foods. And so if you're minimizing your intake of processed foods, you probably don't need to be quite as strict about leaving the salt shaker off the table.
But here's the thing. Your body can't tell the difference between the sodium in processed foods and the sodium that you put on your food from the salt shaker or the sea salt. It's all sodium chloride. On the other hand, we've been telling you for years, processed food is not such a good idea.
There is one important difference between those two salts. If you have bought iodized salt for table use, which is the usual way it's sold, then you're getting iodine along with your salt, which is a good thing. They don't use iodized salt in most processed food.
Great point. Angela in Bradenton, Florida. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. What's your story?
Hi, Joe and Terry. I have been a saltaholic my whole life. I was one of those people that used to fight with my dad over the salt shaker, and I would put salt that I would be able to see it on my food. I like it. And when I was an adult, I did end up with high blood pressure, but I was also 379 pounds.
Wow.
I lost 160 pounds.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I had a lap band, and I was able to get off my blood pressure meds. And even though I still technically have 100 pounds to lose, my blood pressure is wonderful, and sometimes it's even low.
Well, that's a great story, Angela, and I think you make the point that, even though you're consuming salt, your blood pressure is under control, you've lost weight, and you're doing things right. And I think that's the point, Terry. I mean, basically, it's the Goldilocks phenomena. Not too high, not too low. That's what they mean when they say a U-shaped curve.
And Joe, Marty from Plano, Texas, has emailed us to remind listeners that you really need to have sodium and potassium in a balance. That's probably one of the reasons why putting a little salt on your vegetables is a good thing, because you're getting plenty of potassium from those vegetables.
And let's not forget magnesium. All of these minerals are absolutely essential for good health. I mean, it's sort of like going back to the cholesterol craziness. You can't live without cholesterol, and yet we made cholesterol the enemy. You can't live without sodium. But everything in moderation.
Exactly. You don't want to be overdoing it on either end.
Well, one of the big stories, of course, this week, Terry, is the cell phone controversy.
That's right. And might they increase the risk of cancer? The National Toxicology Program announced the results of its study and instantly created a real media frenzy. There's been a lot of confusion about this rat research and what it might mean.
To get the details on this study, we turn to Dr. John Bucher, Associate Director of the National Toxicology Program.
Dr. John Bucher, welcome to the People's Pharmacy.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Bucher, you were the point person for telling the world about the National Toxicology Program study on cell phones. Could you please review very quickly for our listeners what you found?
Sure. So I guess the best way to understand this is to go back a little bit in time, where some of the first epidemiology studies were coming out of Scandinavia that suggested that the heaviest cell phone users at that time were showing up with some gliomas and acoustic neuromas, which are rather rare tumors in humans. This prompted the Food and Drug Administration to nominate cell phone radiation or radiofrequency radiation to the National Toxicology Program. And the findings that we released a couple of weeks ago now are just a part of a much, much larger study, but they're a part of the study that relates to the original findings in humans. So we did in our male rats, these are rodent cancer studies, we did find a small increase in malignant gliomas of the brain, and we found a small increase in what are called schwannomas, and this was in the heart. But the schwannomas are of importance because they are the same tumor type as was found in humans that were called acoustic neuromas.
Dr. Bucher, I know a lot of people may not realize that doing a study of this sort really requires a lot of planning and a lot of work. This is not something you just knock off over a weekend or a couple of months. Can you tell us a little bit about the experience that the National Toxicology Program has with this kind of study?
Well, yes, we've been doing rodent cancer studies since the late 70s. So there have been almost 600 of these studies done. Most of the studies that we do are on chemicals or drugs, environmental chemicals, botanicals, a variety of other substances. So the radiofrequency radiation studies were somewhat of a departure for us and required that we work with experts in the National Institute of Standards and Technology and also with an outfit in Zurich, Switzerland, the ITIS Foundation, which is really the world's experts in designing and building radiofrequency exposure scenarios.
Now, Dr. Bucher, as a pharmacologist, I love what we call dose-response curves, and as a toxicologist, I'm sure you're quite familiar with what I'm talking about. That is to say, a little bit produces a small effect, a bigger effect. A little aspirin might cause a little indigestion. A lot of aspirin might cause a bleeding ulcer. Did you do dose-response studies with regard to the cell phone radiation, and what did you find?
We did dose-response studies. We carried out a number of pilot studies to establish conditions where the exposures to the animals did not cause them to be unable to maintain their temperature within 1 degree range. As you know, radiofrequency radiation has a heating effect. So we were careful to keep the exposures within that level. And this is actually the range that is currently used in setting the standards for radiofrequency radiation from cell phones. So we were within a range that is relevant to the human situation when the cell phones are at the highest power. We did 3 levels of exposures for the male rats, 1.5, 3, and 6 watts per kilogram. It's the level of called a specific absorption rate. And we found increases in the tumors in the hearts of these animals that followed a dose response. The tumors in the brain were of a lower magnitude, and we did not see as clear a signal of dose response.
I guess what most people want to know, Dr. Bucher, is does this have any relevance to me or my family, especially perhaps my children? And I guess it's a little preliminary to discern whether this is a fear, but because the epidemiology has shown some increase in gliomas in other countries, and you found gliomas in your rat study, what are we to make? Is there relevance for humans based on this new study?
Well, we think there's relevance for humans. Exactly what that is has not yet been determined. We are in discussions with the Food and Drug Administration, who has jurisdiction over interpreting the biological effects of radiofrequency radiation over this point at this time. As you point out, the human epidemiology studies have shown effects at the highest doses, and these epidemiology studies have not been without controversy. As you probably are aware, there are varying results. Not all studies have shown these results, and it's been difficult to sort out exactly whether these might have biases that would have made them totally unreliable. But the fact that we saw these effects in our rodent studies does lend some biological credence to the original studies. So we need to go back and try to understand the conditions under which these tumors were found in humans. And we need to do the best we can at trying to understand how the rodent study exposure scenarios, which were to the whole body, not just to the head or in the area around the ear, how these relate to the current guidelines and the current ways that phones are now designed and where the antennas are placing the highest levels of radio frequency when people use their cell phones. A lot of questions that yet need to be answered.
Dr. Booker, it's pretty clear that people are not going to stop using cell phones, despite the study or any conclusions that might be drawn from it. But are there things that people could do to reduce their exposure somewhat?
Well, that's the good news part of this, obviously, is that there are many ways that one can reduce exposure. Radio frequency radiation follows the inverse square law, so the further away from the body, radio frequency radiation drops off dramatically. So simply holding the phone away from the body is the easiest way to reduce your exposure. One can use earbuds, one can use the Bluetooth systems, a variety of different ways of potentially reducing exposures, texting, etc.
Dr. John Booker, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy.
I'm happy to. Thank you.
You've been listening to Dr. John Booker. He's Associate Director of the National Toxicology Program. And if you'd like to read the report for yourself, you can find a link to it at our website.
Terry, there has been so much controversy. There have been articles in the New York Times, for example, that basically say, balderdash, there's no problem. There's been no increase in brain cancer over the last 20 years, despite the fact that billions of people on the planet are using cell phones. And yet there actually has been an increase in gliomas, and those acoustic neuromas, which are also in the brain, are related to the schwannomas that they found in the heart. So it's the same kind of cell.
Right. So it's definitely worth paying attention, and it's worth following Dr. Booker's recommendation that if you can get the cell phone away from your body, do so.
And we will be following up on the People's Pharmacy. We know that you're curious. You'd like to know more. We've been talking about this topic for 25, almost 30 years on the People's Pharmacy, and we promise that we will bring you experts who will perhaps provide a little context for this data.
And those people will be able to answer the questions that we can't answer. So we're actually not encouraging you to call in about cell phones and cancer because we can't say anything further than what Dr. Booker has already said.
Exactly right. We are going to take a short break, but when we come back, we are going to take your calls about stocking your summer first aid kit. What do you keep in yours?
You know, Joe, prevention is paramount. So, which sunscreens and bug sprays did well in Consumer Reports tests?
And we're going to tell you about pepper. We keep that in our first aid kit, and mustard and soy sauce. And it's not for hot dogs, I can assure you of that. And we'd love to hear you join the conversation. Our lines are open at 888-472-3366. What do you do for cuts, burns, muscle cramps? Give us a call. Again, that number is 888-472-3366. You can email us, radio@peoplespharmacy.com, or reach us via Twitter. We're at People's Pharmacy. Again, if you'd like to share your favorite summer home remedies, 888-472-3366.
You're listening to the People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. If you're enjoying this People's Pharmacy podcast, why not head over to our website where you'll find a wealth of information on medications, conditions, home remedies, and ways to keep yourself healthy. You'll find it all at peoplespharmacy.com.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by Red X Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions, helping dry, cracked skin feel utterly soft and smooth. The number is 800-345-7339. The website is uttercream.com.
If you'd like to purchase a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1038, or visit our website. It's peoplespharmacy.com.
Today we're talking about the health stories that matter to you. What do you keep handy so you can enjoy a healthy summer? What do you do for muscle cramps, minor cuts, bruises, or bug bites? Send us an email, radio@peoplespharmacy.com, or give us a call, 888-472-3366. You can reach us on Twitter. We're at People's Pharmacy. The number again, 888-472-3366.
Terry, the Summer Consumer Reports issue is out, and they analyzed sunscreens. And what did they find? I mean, I was really surprised that some of them didn't live up to their billing.
Well, as a matter of fact, quite a few of them did not live up to their billing. Now, part of that may be because they're now billing themselves as having ridiculous SPF numbers, that sun protection factor of 60 and 70.
I think they even go up as high as 100.
But very few of them actually achieve that number. Now, there are a couple, but an awful lot of the ones that are claiming high SPF factors don't make it.
Like 43%.
Yeah.
Just don't live up to those SPF label claims. Well, I'm not so concerned about the ones that don't work as claimed. What are the good ones? What did Consumer Reports say?
Well, the top several on their list include La Roche-Posay, and I don't actually know how to pronounce this properly, La Roche-Posay Anthelios. It has an SPF of 60, so Anthelios 60 melt-in sunscreen milk. Now, it is actually a little pricey, but it definitely provides the SPF 60 that it claims on the label. The next one that Consumer Reports found really lived up to its billing is Pure Sun Defense SPF 50 Disney Frozen. So for the kids who are fans of that cartoon, they're going to be happy to put the sunscreen on. And that's a big part of getting sunscreen to work is you got to put it on.
Well, one I recognize is Coppertone Water Babies with an SPF of 50. And then there is the inexpensive Equate Ultra Protection SPF 50.
That, of course, is the Walmart brand.
And no ad. Sport SPF 50 also came in high. And finally, Trader Joe's Spray SPF 50 if you like a spray rather than a cream.
And there are, of course, other recommendations through Consumer Reports. So pick up a magazine or check it out online.
What about bug repellents? You know, everybody is freaked out about mosquitoes with perhaps good reason. We've got West Nile virus and now Zika.
Well, Zika is more a worry than actually lots of people being infected in the U.S.
Yes, we don't have any Zika-bearing mosquitoes that have been identified yet, but people
it's
are
a real possibility.
freaked.
So it definitely makes sense to protect yourself from insects. And of course, the old standard, which has been around since the 1950s, is DEET. And there are several brands that Consumer Reports found worked very well for 8 hours to keep those mosquitoes from biting. That's Ben's 30% Deep Tick and Wilderness Formula, Repel Scented Family, and Off Deep Woods 8. Then that 8 is a Roman numeral.
Now, for people who just say, I don't like DEET, it melts plastic, I don't want it on my skin, there is picaridin. It actually is synthetic, but it comes from black pepper plants. Sawyer, picaridin 20%, and Natrapel 8 Hour have received good ratings from Consumer Reports.
And Consumer Reports, to do those ratings, actually looked at which bug repellents are keeping the mosquitoes from biting for a long time. And all of those kept mosquitoes, especially the Aedes albopictus, the Asian tiger mosquito, which is similar to the Aedes aegypti, from biting for about 8 hours. Most of these also keep ticks from biting, and so does oil of lemon eucalyptus. Repel lemon eucalyptus 30% scored high on Consumer Reports tests.
Now, we'd like to hear from you. What do you do for muscle cramps, burns, cuts, bruises, sprains, splinters, bug bites, and bee stings? Share your favorite home remedies at 888 472-3366. If the lines are full, you can email us, radio@peoplespharmacy.com, or reach us via Twitter. We're at People's Pharmacy.
And we go to York, South Carolina. Janet, welcome to the People's Pharmacy. Tell us about your remedy.
Hello, my remedy is for cuts and scratches. I work with dogs and I get many, but what's most successful for me is in my dog grooming tub, I put my shower head on jet and I irrigate my cuts and scrapes very thoroughly to ensure infection stays away. And they heal up great.
Well, that's good to know. Now, are you using any soap?
No.
Okay.
Just
Put it
water.
on jet just water. And I put it on jet, which means it's very high force, and it gets in the cuts very deeply, and I don't even get pink and irritated around these cuts and scratches.
Well, that's very interesting. Thank you for sharing. I tend, because of our puppy, I've had some, how shall we say it, bites myself of late, and I've been using alcohol liberally, and it seems to work reasonably well. I've been fortunate, but I like your idea of really irrigating with water. Thank you so much for the call.
Thank you for taking my call.
You bet. Bye-bye. Let's go to Lake Geneva. What is WC?
Wisconsin.
Terry? Wisconsin. Hi, Sinette.
Hi. Hi, Terry and Joe.
Hi,
Hi.
Sinette.
Go ahead and tell us your remedy.
Mine is liquid hand soap or liquid dish soap. If you have any kind of an itch from a mosquito or a weed or any itch at all, put a lot of liquid soap on it and let it dry. And don't touch it. And after it's dry, you won't have any itching anymore. It'll bee sting, anything. Then also, when gnats are bothering you and getting in your hair, and rub, before you go out, rub a little liquid soap around your hairline and behind your ears, your neck, and that will keep them away. And if they already have bitten you, it'll also take away all the itching. But don't use antibacterial soap. There's no point in that. Just regular, any kind of liquid soap. If you don't have liquid soap, take a bar of soap and get it wet and rub it over the spot till it's kind of gooey and let it dry. If it starts to itch again after a few hours, just do it again, and eventually it'll just all be gone.
Well, Sinette, thank you very much. You know, I've never heard this remedy before, Terry.
Exactly right. I have not heard it either, and it does sound potentially a little sticky or gooey. Another thing that people use to keep bites from itching that also may act as a repellent is Listerine.
Aha. Or hot water for those itchy bug bites.
Hot water will absolutely help for the itching. Won't do anything for repelling.
Hot enough to be uncomfortable, not so hot that it will burn. Well, what do you do for bruises or muscle cramps? Or what do you do when you get a mosquito bite or perhaps some heartburn on a camping trip? We'd love to hear your home remedies, your first aid approaches this summer. 888-472-3366 is the number to call. And you can reach us by email. We're at peoplespharmacy.com. We go to Dr. Dennis. Hi, Dr. Dennis.
Good morning. Nice to be on the show. My remedy goes back to I took entomology in college, and something I learned that 90% of all insect venom is detoxified by household ammonia. So, you know, for those fire ant bites, mosquito bites, just about all insect bites, a little bit of ammonia will detoxify it so it stops itching. And also, I lived in South Georgia for quite a while, and we were plagued by gnats, and dryer sheets inside of your hat or around your collar of your shirt when you go outside would keep the gnats away.
The dryer sheets, that sounds fascinating. Now, Dr. Dennis, I have to admit, we have heard this home remedy, the ammonia, before, and you say there's some actual science. I've been a little nervous about it because I've assumed that putting ammonia on your skin could result in damage. How do you do it so you don't hurt yourself?
I just tell my patients to use a cotton ball and just apply it right where the insect bite is. Let it dry, then you can always wash it off afterwards. But once the ammonia gets in contact with whatever the insect toxin is and it's detoxified, you can wash it off.
Now, you're calling from Surfside Beach, South Carolina. I assume you have fire ants in South Carolina?
No, not as bad as in Georgia. We have a few, but we'll see a lot of mosquito bites and just your general insect bites. It's a good remedy for about 90% of the toxins will interact with the ammonia.
Okay, and we're going to tell people to be very cautious with that ammonia, be very sparing because it probably can be toxic to some people or irritate their skin. You know, some of our favorites, Terry, we've talked about them many times on the People's Pharmacy. Take along on your next bike trip or perhaps your hike or in your first aid kit packets of yellow mustard. Not only will they be good for cramps, and those muscles can cramp up on a long hike, but if you get heartburn, a little packet of yellow mustard can work for that. And if you're roasting marshmallows around the campfire and you get a little burn, again, yellow mustard.
So for the cramps, and for the heartburn, you're swallowing the yellow mustard. For the burn, you're dabbing it on.
Right. 888-472-3366 is the number to call if you've got a home remedy to share or something you like to keep in your first aid kit. We go to Charleston, South Carolina. Hi, Jordan.
Hi, how are you?
We're well. What's up?
I just want to let you guys know that Melaleuca oil is good for bug bites. It helps with the itch on my girls, and it also prevents bugs from biting you. So you could either put it on there directly or mix it with a little water in a spray bottle and spray it, and it's absolutely amazing. My mom always pushed it on us, and I didn't believe it until I had kids of my own. So,
well, thank you for sharing that. Terry, what is Melaleuca? And please spell it.
Well, Melaleuca, Melaleuca, and it's actually tea tree oil. And Demetria emailed us to let us know that her go-to is tea tree oil for fire ant bites and other bites. It works fast, and it's much better than cortisone.
Now, Melaleuca, doesn't this come from, like, Australia?
It does. Tea tree is the common name for it. Melaleuca is the technical name, and the tree grows in Australia. Absolutely.
Now, one of the things that people often run into this time of year, cuts, scratches, scrapes. If you're bleeding, what should you take along on your hike?
Well, I would take a few packets of black pepper because it can stop that bleeding quickly. In many cases, not all the time. Obviously, you got a really terrible cut and it's gushing blood. You need medical attention.
Absolutely. But a couple of packets of black pepper will fit in your backpack, as will a couple of packets of yellow mustard. So they're very convenient. What about ticks? A lot of people, I think justifiably, are freaked out when they find a tick crawling on their skin. How to remove the tick and then what to do with it once you've removed it?
Well, the first thing is do use insect repellent to keep the ticks off you. If you know you're going out in the woods or in a meadow where there's tall grass, absolutely cover your skin to the extent possible, and where your skin is exposed, be sure to put on insect repellent. The second thing is that if you find that tick walking around on you before it has bitten you, a little bit of Scotch tape to get it off your skin and wrap it up so that it can't crawl around and bite anybody else is a great trick that we learned right here on the People's Pharmacy Radio Show.
Yes, it entombs them, and it will no longer cause anybody else any mischief, and you can just stick it in your pocket and take it home and throw it away. I like spraying my shoes and my socks with one of those insect repellents because it may discourage some of those chiggers from getting on. And I'm going blackberry picking in a few hours, and I definitely do not want any chiggers taking a hold of my skin.
Now, Joe, Liz has emailed from Pittsboro, North Carolina, and she says she recommended a neem spray to a friend who works outdoors. It's made for pets, but it works on humans, and it keeps the mosquitoes and chiggers from biting and keeps the ticks from attaching, she says.
Now, Another thing you might want to try is good old-fashioned amber Listerine. It's a great anesthetic because it's got a lot of alcohol in it. Some people say it's helpful against mosquito bites and helpful against sunburn, but it's really terrific against lice. So if you want to prevent lice, you might send your kids off to summer camp with a little bottle of Listerine, which they can soak their hair in.
They also should be instructed not to share hats and the other things that brushes, combs, etc.
Exactly. Let's go to Judy in Charlottesville, Virginia. Hi, Judy. We just have a couple of minutes left.
Hi. I use witch hazel on insect bites to get rid of the itch.
Oh, that sounds like a great idea. And, of course, witch hazel has another really great use, which is to soothe hemorrhoids.
So you've got a couple of benefits there from witch hazel. We're very fond of witch hazel, and we actually have a couple of trees growing in our backyard. Thanks for the call, Judy.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.
And Joe, Chris wrote to say vinegar works great for burns, including sunburn. I use it all the time for minor burns in the kitchen if I pick up a hot pan. It takes a couple of minutes to work, but it reduces the pain a lot and helps to reduce blistering. And that's a great tip and something to add to our armamentarium of taking care of kitchen burns.
Now, what about bee stings or wasp stings?
Onion, cut onion.
Cut onion is an old classic. Dr. Eric Block, one of the world's foremost onion chemists, told us about that. Stephanie says she uses plantain for wasp bites. And plantain, what is that, Terry?
Well, it's actually a weed that can grow in a lot of yards. We've got quite a bit in our front yard, as it turns out. And the leaves grow in kind of a rosette, and then it sends up these tall stalks with little seed things at the end of them that little boys used to shoot off at each other back in the day.
What do you do with the plantain?
You would mash up the leaves and put it on.
Okay, and people tell us that works against poison ivy as well. Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for sharing your home remedies for us. Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Sophie Copeland provided technical assistance. Al Wodarski is the engineer. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC, and we'd like to wish WUNC a happy 40th anniversary.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
If you'd like to order a copy of today's show, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1038. The number again, 800-732-2334. Find it online at peoplespharmacy.com, where you'll also can tell us what you think about the show or find information on prescription drugs, herbs, home remedies, and links to the studies we talked about.
That's the SALT study and the cell phone study. You can also subscribe to the free podcast of our show and get our free email newsletter. It's all there at peoplespharmacy.com. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening. Please join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.
Here in America, work is in trouble. We've offshored our manufacturing, sent away good jobs, and lost so much ability to make things. American Giant is a company that's pushing back against this tide. They make high-quality clothing, sweatshirts, jeans, dresses, jackets, and so much more, right here in the USA. Visit American-Giant.com and get 20% off your first order when you use code STAPLE20 at checkout. That's 20% off your first order at American-Giant.com, promo code STAPLE20.